Here's the thing about The Office. You think you know it. You've seen every episode. You've got a Dundee on your shelf, probably. You've sent the "that's what she said" gif so many times your phone auto-completes it. But what if I told you that the show you think you know almost didn't exist? That the guy you associate with Michael Scott wasn't even supposed to be there? And that one of the most beloved finales in television history almost ended in a completely different, much darker way? Stick around, because things are about to get weird. Hi, my name is Aaron, and this is Old TV Cinema, Fact 1. The American pilot was almost a shot-for-shot copy of the UK version. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning of The Office in America is a lot stranger than most people realize. When NBC decided to adapt the British version of The Office, created by Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant, they didn't hand it to a team of writers and say, "Go nuts." They handed it to Greg Daniels, a veteran comedy writer who'd worked on Saturday Night Live and King of the Hill, and they basically said, "Okay, just kinda do what they did over there." And for a hot minute, that's exactly what almost happened. The first version of the American pilot was so close to the original British pilot that it was practically a transcript. Same beats, same jokes, same uncomfortable silences. Michael Scott was essentially David Brent with a different name and an American accent. NBC tested it with audiences, and the response was, to put it politely, not great. American audiences who'd seen the British version found it redundant. And audiences who hadn't seen the British version just found it weird and unlikable. Ricky Gervais, for his part, was not thrilled. He's talked about watching early cuts of the American version and being deeply uncomfortable with how closely it mirrored his own show. He didn't block it, legally or creatively, but he made his feelings fairly clear. He thought the format needed to be reinvented for American audiences, not photocopied. Greg Daniels agreed. He pushed to diverge from the source material as quickly as possible. By episode 2 of season 1, the show was already carving out its own identity. By season 2, it had essentially become a different show wearing the same outfit. The British version was a dark, almost tragic portrait of a man who didn't know how pathetic he was. The American version took that same premise and found something warmer inside it, something that could run for 9 seasons instead of 2. Gervais has since said he thinks the American version surpassed the original in many ways, and considering that statement came from a man who does not hand out compliments easily, that tells you everything. Fact 2. Steve Carell was not the first choice for Michael Scott. Here's one that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. The actor you cannot separate from the role of Michael Scott, the man who made "That's What She Said" a part of the English language, was not the first person NBC wanted in that chair. When casting began for the American Office, several names were floated for the role of regional manager. Paul Giamatti was approached and passed. He didn't see himself in the format. Bob Odenkirk, who you now know as Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, actually auditioned and came extremely close. By multiple accounts, Odenkirk was seriously considered. He had the comedic chops. He had the awkwardness. He had the range. Executives liked him. And then there was Steve Carell. In 2004, when casting was happening, Carell was not a movie star. He was a recognizable face from The Daily Show, an Anchorman, which had just come out. But he was not a household name. He wasn't the obvious choice. He was actually considered something of a risk. What sold NBC, ultimately, was Carell's ability to make Michael Scott simultaneously unbearable and sympathetic. In his audition, he apparently nailed something that Odenkirk, for all his talent, hadn't quite hit. There was a sadness underneath the obliviousness. Michael Scott wasn't just annoying, he was lonely, and Carell found that in the room. The rest, as they say, is television history. Carell went on to win a Golden Globe for the role. He was nominated for an Emmy 6 consecutive times, and Odenkirk went on to be just fine, so nobody needs to lose any sleep there. But imagine Bob Odenkirk as Michael Scott. Genuinely sit with that for a second. It's not bad, it's just completely different. And the show might have been completely different too. Fact 3. The mockumentary format wasn't just a gimmick, it was a lifesaver. People talk about the documentary style of The Office like it was a bold creative choice, and it was. But what most people don't realize is that it wasn't just an aesthetic decision, it was a practical one. It saved the show. Here's the problem NBC had in 2004 and 2005. They had a show about a deeply unlikable boss doing and saying cringeworthy things with no laugh track, no studio audience, no musical cues to tell viewers how to feel. Test audiences were confused. They didn't know if they were supposed to laugh. They didn't know if Michael Scott was the hero or the villain or what. The mockumentary format solved that problem elegantly. By framing everything as a documentary being filmed by an unseen crew, the show gave the audience permission to observe rather than judge. The camera became a co-conspirator. When Jim looked directly into the lens after a particularly insane Michael moment, he was speaking for every viewer at home. You see this? This is real. This is happening. It also freed the writers from traditional sitcom structure. No need for a live audience. No need to build jokes to a punchline. Scenes could breathe. Characters could be uncomfortable for a long time before anything resolved. The format created space for a kind of cringe comedy that American television had never really done before at this scale. And here's the kicker. If the show had been produced in a traditional multi-camera format with a live studio audience, it almost certainly would have been canceled after season 1. We'll get to that. But the mockumentary style bought the show time to find its audience, because audiences willing to sit with discomfort tend to be loyal audiences. And loyal audiences tell their friends. The format wasn't a gimmick, it was the whole game. Fact 4. The cast did way more improv than you think. If you've ever watched a deleted scenes reel from The Office, you already know this show had more material than it knew what to do with. But the improv on that set went far deeper than most people realize. Greg Daniels built the show's production process around the idea that the cast should have room to discover things in the moment. Scripts were written, obviously. Full scripts, detailed scripts. But actors were encouraged to stay in character between takes, to riff, to try things. Multiple cameras were often running simultaneously to catch anything unexpected. Steve Carell, who came from an improv background at Second City in Chicago, was particularly known for going off script in ways that were either genius or completely unusable, sometimes both in the same take. The "that's what she said" jokes that peppered the series weren't always scripted. Many of them came from Carell finding a straight line in the dialogue and deciding in the moment that he couldn't let it pass. Rainn Wilson has talked about how he developed Dwight's more extreme characteristics through improvisation. The beat farming, the survivalist preparation, the obsessive devotion to Michael, a lot of that texture came from Wilson, playing in the margins of scenes and finding something the writers then incorporated into future scripts. And the talking head confessional segments, those little moments where characters address the camera directly, were frequently used as a sandbox. Actors would do the scripted version, and then the crew would keep the camera rolling and let them go wherever they wanted. Some of the most quoted moments in the show's history came out of those unscripted extensions. The scripts were the floor, not the ceiling. And that distinction is a big part of what made the show feel so alive. Fact 5. John Krasinski didn't want the job. John Krasinski walked into his audition for Jim Halpert planning to leave early. I'm not exaggerating. Krasinski has told this story in interviews, and it is genuinely one of the better accidental career stories in Hollywood. He was a young actor trying to break through, and he'd driven out to Los Angeles from New York specifically to audition for The Office. But he hadn't seen the British version, so a friend made him watch it the night before his audition. He loved it, and then immediately panicked because he thought Martin Freeman's Tim Canterbury was so perfectly cast in the original that recreating the role was essentially impossible. Who could do it better? Why would you even try? He showed up to the audition convinced he was going to tank it, get it over with, and go home. Instead, something clicked. The chemistry with the material, with the camera, just worked. The casting directors asked him to come back. Then again. And then again. Krasinski has said he almost turned it down, even after being offered the role, because he was worried about being locked into a television series when he had film ambitions. He was 25 years old, and he thought saying yes to a network sitcom might close doors rather than open them. His mother, by various accounts, told him to stop being an idiot and take the job. Maternal advice being what it is, he listened. Jim Halpert became one of the defining characters of 2000s television comedy, and Krasinski went on to direct A Quiet Place, which made over $300 million worldwide, so the film ambitions worked out fine. But it almost didn't happen because he watched the wrong DVD the night before an audition. Fact 6. Jenna Fischer's audition tape became part of the show. This one is strange in a wonderful way. When Jenna Fischer auditioned for the role of Pam Beesly, she didn't just prepare sides from the script. She created a character. She wrote a fake resume for Pam. She put together a detailed personal history. She made choices about who this woman was that went far beyond what the audition required. The casting team was so struck by what Fischer brought in that elements of her audition, her choices, her specific physical mannerisms, her tone, fed directly into how the character was written going forward. Pam, as she exists on screen, is not entirely the Pam on the original page. She's partially the Pam that Jenna Fischer invented in an audition room. And here's where it gets specifically strange. Fischer actually had a MySpace page in character as Pam during the early seasons. She would post things as Pam, interact with fans as Pam. The line between actor and character was blurry in ways that were unusual, even for method-oriented performers. Fischer later said that Pam was so close to who she actually was at that point in her life. A young woman who felt stuck and was waiting for something to change. That playing her didn't always feel like acting. It felt like processing, which is either beautiful or concerning, depending on how you look at it. Probably both, honestly. Fact 7. The writer's room was in chaos. After season 3, from the outside, the office looked like a well-oiled machine by the time it hit season 3. Top 20 ratings, Emmy nominations, cultural phenomenon, everything was great. Behind the scenes, the writer's room was starting to fracture. The 2007 and 2008 Writers Guild of America strike hit the office particularly hard. The show had built its entire identity around a writing staff that functioned as a tight creative unit. Greg Daniels had assembled a remarkable group that included B.J. Novak, Mindy Kaling, Paul Lieberstein, and Michael Schur, many of whom were also acting in the show. When the strike happened, that unit scattered, projects stalled, momentum broke. But the damage wasn't just logistical, it was creative. When production resumed, some of the key writers who had helped define the show's voice moved on to other opportunities. Michael Schur and Greg Daniels co-created Parks and Recreation, which launched in 2009. Mindy Kaling was developing what would eventually become the Mindy Project. B.J. Novak was pulling in multiple directions. The writer's room that rebuilt itself for seasons 5, 6, and 7 was talented, but it wasn't the same room, and you can feel it if you watch the show closely. The precision of the early seasons, that perfect calibration between cringe and warmth, starts to wobble. Plotlines get bigger and broader. Characters start doing things that feel slightly off. The Michael Scott Paper Company arc in season 5 is genuinely great, but by season 6, 7, 8, something had shifted. Nobody tanked the show on purpose, but the strike cracked the foundation and the building was never quite as solid afterward. Fact 8. Michael Scott's goodbye was unscripted. Get ready, because this one is going to get you. Season 7, Episode 22. Goodbye, Michael. Steve Carell's final episode as a series regular. If you've seen it, you remember it. If you haven't seen it, go watch it right now and then come back. I'll wait. The episode was meticulously planned. Writers spent weeks on it. The cast was briefed. The production was careful and deliberate. And then in Michael Scott's final scene with Pam at the airport, Steve Carell went completely off script. Carell had already removed his microphone, which was written into the scene, meaning his final words to Pam before walking through security were technically inaudible. But he was still talking, he was saying something, and the camera was still rolling. What he said in that moment was never revealed publicly. Jenna Fischer has spoken about it in interviews and said it was deeply personal and completely unscripted, and that whatever he said made her cry for real. Not actor crying, actually crying. The crew was crying, directors were crying. Multiple people who were on set that day have described it as one of the most emotional things they'd ever witnessed in a professional context. Carell left the show the same way he'd played the character for 7 years, completely present, completely committed, and completely in charge of the moment. He knew what he wanted that goodbye to be, and he just did it. The fact that we can't hear what he said makes it more powerful, not less. Some things are better left between the people in the room. Fact 9. Ed Helms' missing tooth is real. This one is short, sweet, and genuinely delightful. Season 7, Episode 6. Andy Bernard loses a tooth during a housing crisis at the office. The writers needed to show the missing tooth for the episode to work. Problem was, they needed a prosthetic, which takes time and costs money, and they were on a tight schedule. Except, it wasn't a problem at all, because Ed Helms actually has a missing tooth. He had a congenitally absent lateral incisor, which means the adult tooth simply never grew in. He'd been wearing a dental implant for years. For the episode, he just took it out. No prosthetics, no special effects, no makeup department scrambling for a solution. Ed Helms just removed part of his face and went to work. The writers found out about this during pre-production for the episode, and by multiple accounts, the room was thrilled. There's a particular kind of joy that comes from a production problem solving itself. And this was one of those moments. Helms has talked about it in interviews with a kind of cheerful nonchalance that makes you like him even more. He has a gap in his mouth, and he used it for comedy. Honestly, that's the most Andy Bernard thing Ed Helms could possibly have done. Fact 10. The dinner party episode was shot in 4 days dinner party. Season 4, Episode 9. If you've watched The Office, you already know this episode. Possibly the most uncomfortable 30 minutes in the show's history. Michael and Jan's disastrous dinner party, as witnessed by Jim, Pam, Andy, and Angela. Plasma screen television mounted to the wall on a tiny arm. Jan's candle business. The Hunter CD playing on repeat. The Dundee through the television. All of it. It's considered by many fans and critics to be the single best episode of the entire series. And it was produced in a scramble. The 2007 WGA strike, which we already talked about, froze production on The Office for months. When the strike ended and the show came back, they had a limited number of episodes left to produce for Season 4. The writers were under enormous pressure to deliver quickly. Dinner Party was written fast, produced fast, shot in approximately 4 days, which for a show that was already considered efficient was extremely compressed. And yet, it's perfect. Every moment lands. The escalating horror of Michael and Jan's relationship, the helpless expressions of their guests, the small physical details of the apartment that tell you everything you need to know about where these two people are. It's tight in the way that pressure sometimes makes things tight. The strike that damaged so much of the show's later creative momentum accidentally forced the conditions that produced its greatest episode. That's either ironic or poetic, depending on your mood. Fact 11. BJ Novak and Mindy Kaling. We're dating in real life here is one that the show basically didn't bother hiding. BJ Novak, who wrote for the show and played Ryan Howard, the temp, and Mindy Kaling, who also wrote for the show and played Kelly Kapoor, were in an on-again, off-again romantic relationship for most of the show's run. By their own admission, they have both talked about it publicly and at length. The Ryan and Kelly dynamic on screen, which is built entirely around Ryan being emotionally unavailable and Kelly being completely devoted to someone who treats her poorly, was apparently not a massive leap from reality. Kaling has said in interviews and in her books that the two of them had a complicated, deeply intertwined relationship that blurred personal and professional lines constantly, which, when you consider that they were also writing the characters who were in this relationship, raises some genuinely interesting questions about where the fiction ended. Novak and Kaling have described each other publicly as best friends and as something more complicated than that, in the kind of way that suggests the story doesn't fit neatly into any one category. They remain close. They still work together. Kaling has said Novak is her best friend. Novak wrote a children's book dedicated to her. The Office is full of will they won't they energy, most of it focused on Jim and Pam. But the real slow burn was happening in the writer's room the whole time. Fact 12. Rainn Wilson auditioned for Michael Scott. Before he was Dwight Kurt Schrute, assistant to the regional manager, beat farmer, Lackawanna County volunteer sheriff's deputy, and the most singular comedic creation of the 2000s, Rainn Wilson was sitting in an audition room reading sides for the role of Michael Scott. He came in for the lead. He read for the regional manager. By accounts from the casting process, he wasn't bad. He has a kind of manic energy that could theoretically work for a character like Michael, but the casting team saw something else. They saw Dwight. They asked Wilson to read for the supporting role instead. He did. And whatever happened in that room when Rainn Wilson started being Dwight Schrute apparently made it immediately clear that this was the correct allocation of human being. Wilson has talked about this in interviews with genuine good humor. He didn't get the lead. He got something arguably better. Dwight Schrute is a more interesting character than Michael Scott in many ways. More specific, more committed, more genuinely strange. There's a universe where Rainn Wilson plays Michael Scott, and it's fine. There's no universe where anyone else plays Dwight. The casting director who made that call deserves some kind of award that doesn't exist yet. Best redirect, maybe. Hand it over. Fact 13. The theme song was written in an afternoon. The Office theme. 40 seconds of acoustic guitar that immediately puts every person who watched this show between 2005 and 2013 into a specific emotional state. You hear those first few notes and you're back, you're in Scranton, you're watching Jim glance at the camera, you're watching Dwight staple things. That piece of music was written by Jay Ferguson, a Canadian musician and composer, in an afternoon, for not very much money, on a fairly tight deadline. Ferguson was hired to produce a theme that captured the show's tone, understated, slightly melancholy, warm, but not sentimental. Something that felt like a Tuesday morning in a medium-sized office park in northeastern Pennsylvania, which is a very specific brief. He nailed it on essentially the first pass. The acoustic finger-picking, the slightly meandering melody, the way it builds just slightly before cutting off. It's perfect for a show about people who are trying to find meaning in mundane circumstances. Ferguson has spoken about the assignment with characteristic modesty. He did a job. The job worked. But the theme he wrote in an afternoon became one of the most recognizable pieces of music in television history. It's been covered, remixed, and played at weddings. As people have it tattooed on their bodies, it's a cultural artifact now. 40 seconds, one afternoon, sometimes things just work. Fact 14. NBC almost canceled the show after season 1. This is the one that should make every Office fan slightly nauseous every time they think about it. Season 1 of The Office aired in the spring of 2005. 6 episodes. That was it. A short order, cautious, we'll see how this goes. And the answer was not great. Ratings for season 1 were lukewarm at best. The show debuted to decent numbers, but declined as the season progressed. Critical response was mixed. Some reviewers loved it. Others found it too uncomfortable, too niche, too British in its sensibility, even in its American form. American audiences weren't used to sitcoms without punchlines and pauses. NBC executives were not enthusiastic about a second season. The internal conversations were apparently serious. The show was expensive for its ratings. The tone was unusual. The lead character was actively unpleasant in ways that mainstream audiences hadn't warmed to yet. What saved it, by multiple accounts, was a combination of factors. DVD sales of season 1 were surprisingly strong. The show had found an audience that was watching on their own schedule rather than live. NBC was also developing its Thursday night comedy block into something coherent, and The Office fit a slot they needed to fill. And Greg Daniels made a direct case to the network that season 2 would be different, funnier, more accessible, without losing the show's identity. They got the renewal. Season 2 premiered in September of 2005. It was a completely different viewing experience. Casino Night, the season 2 finale, is considered one of the best episodes of television comedy ever made. The show climbed to number 20 in the Nielsen ratings. The Office was a hit. 6 episodes that almost didn't get a follow-up turned into 9 seasons and one of the most beloved shows in television history. NBC came this close to walking away from it. They did not, and we should probably thank someone for that. Fact 15. The finale almost didn't have a happy ending. And here we are, the last one, and it's a big one. The Office series finale aired on May 16, 2013. It drew over 15 million viewers, the show's highest ratings in years. Critics loved it, fans loved it. Dwight finally married Angela. Jim and Pam decided to move to Austin. Michael Scott showed up. Everyone cried. It was, by any reasonable measure, a near-perfect send-off. But that's not the finale that was originally discussed. In the writer's room during the development of the final season, there were serious conversations about a much darker ending. The show had always had an undercurrent of melancholy beneath the comedy. People stuck in jobs they didn't choose. Relationships that formed because proximity substituted for connection. The question of whether the documentary these characters had been filming for 9 years actually changed anything about their lives. One direction that was explored involved leaning into the darkness. The idea of an ending where things didn't resolve neatly, where Jim and Pam's marriage remained strained rather than repaired, where the documentary aired and the characters confronted uncomfortable truths about themselves. An ending that honored the show's complicated relationship with happiness rather than simply delivering it. The creative team ultimately stepped back from that edge. Greg Daniels, who returned to run the final season after Parks and Recreation, made the call that the show's audience had spent 9 years with these people and deserved to see them okay. Not perfect, not wrapped in a bow, but okay. And so Pam sold the house in Scranton, and Jim chose his family over the job, and Dwight got the office he always wanted. All Michael Scott stood at the back of a church and whispered that he had been told there was an open bar because Michael Scott could not resist a joke even at a wedding, even after years away, even in a finale. And it landed perfectly because Steve Carell understood this character down to his bones. The darker version might have been braver, more challenging, more in line with what the show's British predecessor would have done. But the version we got was what 9 seasons of caring about these people actually earned. A happy ending. Or close enough. And that is 15 genuinely weird facts about The Office that most people don't know. From Bob Odenkirk almost playing Michael Scott, to a one afternoon theme song, to a finale that almost broke everyone's heart in the wrong direction. The thing about The Office, and I know this sounds like something you'd put on a motivational poster above a water cooler, is that it was a show about people who were stuck in a town, stuck in a job, stuck in relationships they hadn't quite chosen. And somehow it made that feel warm instead of bleak. That's not an easy trick. That takes real craft and real care, and a lot of takes, and apparently a guy under the floor operating a puppet. Wait, wrong show. If you enjoyed this deep dive, give the video a like, and subscribe to Old TV Cinema for more. We do this every week. It's what we do. Thanks for watching.